There was many things that went wrong on this trip, but the hardest part of this trip was planning the route, and I failed many times at that. Alright, so we have had to do a total reshuffling of our travel route. Instead of doing, a luxury tour, staying a few nights at a few different spots, we have to do the fastest route possible to the north. And this guy wants to say hi. I think that means hi. Before I get into the route exactly of what I wanted to do, let me tell you what the end goal for this trip was. The end goal was to get to the Ha Giang Loop. I wanted to spend at least 1 week motorbiking through the beautiful mountains on the northern border of Vietnam and China, through all these beautiful, beautiful valleys. This was the goal that I had for my trip in mind. Now, in order to get there, I had to plan a route all the way from the south of Vietnam up to the north. And the route that I had originally planned, it definitely didn't pan out. The reason being, there was many things that came up along the way that kind of delayed my trip, that made it so that I had to stay extra days, or that I just couldn't get to the next destination in time. And what this ended up doing was it made me cut out a lot of beautiful places that I really wish I could have gone to. But what were the places that I chose to sacrifice, and what were the places that I actually ended up going to? Well, my trip, as we know, began in Ho Chi Minh City. Ho Chi Minh City was the place where I purchased my motorbike, where I met some amazing people, and began what would be one of the most incredible adventures of my year abroad. With my bike purchased, I began my trip from Ho Chi Minh City over to Thout. And if you watched last video, you know everything that happened there. Everything was going to plan so far. From Thout, I planned to go to Quoc. Quoc was one of the islands on the far west in the south of Vietnam, a beautiful, more touristy part of southern Vietnam that you could go and visit. And there was a lot of interesting things that I did see in Quoc. A fully built European city that was abandoned. This is really strange. Like, it looks like a beautiful European courtyard, right? Then look inside. It's just empty. So strange. So strange. Some war memorial, more floating markets on an empty beach. But this is where the first issue happened, where things started to not go as planned. So it looks like we're gonna have to stay in Quoc for at least another day. All of the ferries, flights, everything's been canceled. This typhoon is coming. So my 2-night stay in Quoc turned into a 4-night stay, because there was no flights, there was no ferries, there was no way to get off the island. I was stuck. And this is where I had to make the first decision. What part of Vietnam would I now cut out of my trip? The next part of the trip had 3 options that I could choose from. The Cat Vien National Park, the famous mountainous Dalat, or Buon. Now, before I continue pronouncing more of these Vietnamese names, I do just want to apologize. My pronunciation is horrible. I'm doing my best. So from those 3 places, I had to make a decision, because the route I wanted to take was leading up north. And if I would have gone to Dalat, it would have been on the more eastern middle side of Vietnam, and it would have added a few extra days onto my trip. If I had gone to the national park, it wouldn't have been far enough along to make up for those lost 2 days. So I ended up going to Buon. Now, since I had chosen to go to Buon, what it did was it cut out the entire coastline of Vietnam from my trip. So I chose the more mountainous, rural side of Vietnam to go north. From Buon, I then ventured off to Con Tum. Con Tum was a beautiful, secluded city that was kind of tucked away from everything. I spent an amazing night at a homestay with some very, very kind and generous people that said I was one of the few tourists that had been there since the pandemic. But I couldn't stay long. I still had to make up for those extra days. So I pushed ahead. From Con Tum, I went to Hoi An. Hoi An is one of the most famous cities in Vietnam. When it comes to things that you can do for tourists, it is one of the best places you can be. And while Hoi An had been one of the hardest hit places by that typhoon, I still had an amazing experience where I met new people, I made friends with other travelers, more sane travelers who hadn't decided to motorbike across Vietnam, but had decided to just backpack. And while I was in Hoi An, I decided to entrust my life and my beard in the hands of a kind local man. If you don't know anything about the Vietnamese people, they aren't historically known for having full beards. So I was a little bit worried how it would go when he cut it, and I think he did a pretty good job. So one of the issues though, I'd spent a few extra nights in Hoi An just because I liked it so much, but because I had spent those extra nights, now I had to continue my rapid progress up to the north. And if you remember back to the very first episode, I talked about my inspiration for this whole trip. It was that Top Gear episode where they went through the Hai Van Pass. And the Hai Van Pass is just a little bit north of Hoi An. And so I had to do the Hai Van Pass. And it was one of the most incredible experiences. Going up through this beautiful mountain pass, I started to get higher and higher into the cloud layer. And that is once again where devastation hit my trip, where I infamously broke my clutch on my motorbike and had to ride down the whole second part of the Hai Van Pass with no clutch, no engine running, just rolling and hoping that my brakes would work. Alright, so we made it down cruising in neutral. Got some guys that are gonna help me out, hopefully get it all fixed up. A little update, he doesn't have the proper part, so he's gonna try and like jimmy rig something with the clutch. Alright, we got a jimmy rig clutch. We should be good. It looks kind of hilarious. It's got so many buttons and dials now on my handlebar. It's like a little spaceship, but we're off now. So with my bike jimmy rigged, fixed up as good as it could be, I made it all the way to Vinh that evening, late at night, exhausted and ready to be done. I'm exhausted, but you know, still having a little bit of fun here. Vinh was a very interesting place because there wasn't very many tourists that ever really came here. So I stood out like a sore thumb. And this is where I had an experience where the people were just excited to see me and wanted to talk to me and learn about me and learn about my trip. But I couldn't stay long in Vinh because they didn't have a clutch for my Honda Wind. So I had to continue progressing further north. And my next stop was one of the most magical, beautiful places I'd been. It was Ninh Binh. After everything I'd been through, the hundreds and thousands of kilometers that I'd motorbiked so far, I was so close to getting to the north, and I had just a few extra days until my week-long trip in the Ha Giang Loop. And so, with my decision, I decided to stay a couple extra days in Ninh Binh and do some exploring, see some of the beautiful sights that Ninh Binh has to offer. And then I would go straight to the Ha Giang Loop. And that was the route that I ended up taking, where I had originally planned on having a full 30 days of traveling, exploring, and seeing Vietnam. A total of 8 of those 30 days were lost days. Days where I couldn't travel because my motorbike, days where I couldn't travel because of typhoons and storms, or days where I was just too exhausted to even want to go and travel. So out of those 30 days, I'd lost 8 days. Now I know I say that this was kind of a failure, but in those 8 days, I still had an incredible time and had some amazing experiences. So I didn't actually fail the trip, but I 100% failed the planning. And the thing that I learned the most is that you can't plan to do 100 things in 30 days. You can't plan to see 30 places in 30 days, and you definitely wouldn't enjoy it if you achieved it. So slowing down my trip, having those 8 days that I lost, having those extra days where I spent more time enjoying myself, engaging in the culture, those ended up being some of the more valuable days that I had on this trip. And at the end of the day, I still managed to reach my goal of doing 1 week on the Ha Giang Loop. And it was the most incredible part of my entire trip through Vietnam, and I can't wait for you to watch it.